What would you do if your family vacation turned into a nightmare you couldn't escape? Imagine arriving in a quaint coastal town, ready to enjoy Halloween festivities, only to discover ancient spirits waiting to lure your children into the shadows. This isn't just a ghost story. It's what really happened that night, and it still haunts them to this day. Now, let's begin. 3 years ago, on Halloween night, my family and I decided to do something different. We figured we'd skip the usual routine of trick-or-treating and scary movie marathons at home. Instead, we thought it'd be a good idea to take a little vacation, get away for a while, and make some new memories. My wife found this small coastal town in Ireland, the kind of place that seems like it's been plucked right out of a postcard. It wasn't super touristy, which we liked, and the locals were known for their big Halloween celebration. The festival they held every year was called Samhain. Apparently, it's the old Celtic version of Halloween, going back thousands of years. The brochure we found online mentioned parades, storytelling sessions by firelight, and local delicacies we had never even heard of before. There was even going to be a guided ghost tour of some ancient ruins up on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The kids, Emma and Jake, were excited, especially when they heard that there were stories of witches and old spirits connected to the place. We thought it was just the right amount of spooky to get into the Halloween spirit, without anything too over the top. The town itself was beautiful, exactly what we expected. Cobblestone streets, stone cottages with thatched roofs, little shops and pubs that had been there for generations. People decorated every inch of the town with carved pumpkins, dried corn stalks, and old wooden masks that looked handmade. Some houses had strange symbols drawn in chalk over the doorways, which we assumed were just part of the local Halloween tradition. When we checked into the little bed and breakfast where we were staying, the woman at the front desk, her name was Maeve, gave us a warm smile and handed us a pamphlet about the town's history. She told us that it was common for families to visit during Samhain, though in recent years the festival had grown smaller. Fewer people wanted to be out here, she said, especially after hearing stories of the Banshee of the Cliffs. At first, we thought she was just playing up the local folklore, trying to make things sound more exciting for tourists. But she kept a serious tone, like it wasn't something to joke about. She told us the Banshee only appeared on the night of Samhain, when the boundary between the living and the dead was said to be the thinnest. It's just an old story, of course, she said with a smile, but the way her voice dropped at the end made me feel like there was more she wasn't telling us. My wife, Claire, gave me a look that said, well, this is off to a weird start. We didn't think much of it, though. After all, part of the fun of visiting places like this is hearing about local legends, right? That first evening, we unpacked, settled in, and then decided to take a walk around the town before the festival kicked off the next day. The air smelled crisp, with a hint of the sea on the wind. It felt refreshing, even though the town was eerily quiet for the most part. I remember thinking it was strange for such a small town to have so few people out, especially with the holiday coming up. The only sounds were the occasional squawk of seagulls and the rustling of the wind through the narrow alleys. Jake, my youngest, pointed out a weird mask hanging on someone's door. It looked like it had been made from old wood with deep, jagged carvings. The thing looked ancient, almost ceremonial, with 2 slanted holes for eyes and a crooked line where the mouth should have been. I thought it was just part of the Halloween decorations, but it gave me the creeps for some reason. I could tell Claire felt it too, but we didn't say anything. No point in scaring the kids. After about an hour of wandering, we found a small pub near the harbor and decided to grab an early dinner. Inside, it was warm and cozy. There was a fire going in the hearth, and the bartender greeted us like we were old friends. A few locals sat at the bar, quietly chatting over their pints. One of them, a man with a thick gray beard, overheard us asking about the ghost tour and chimed in. "So you're going up to the castle tomorrow night?" He said, more like a statement than a question. "Brave thing to do with little ones. They say the Banshee's been active this year." I chuckled nervously, trying to play along. "Yeah? And what exactly does that mean?" He gave me a look like he knew something I didn't. "It means," he said slowly, "that if the Banshee calls a name, that soul is as good as gone." He drained his glass and set it down hard on the counter, like he was trying to make a point. Claire shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Emma, who was always curious, asked, "What happens if she calls your name?" The man leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "You'll follow her," he said simply, "whether you want to or not." At that point, I figured he was just trying to give us a good scare. Claire gave me a look like, "All right, this is getting weird. Time to go." I paid the bill, and we got out of there as quickly as we could. But that night, as we walked back to the bed and breakfast, I couldn't shake the feeling that the old man wasn't entirely joking. The next morning, we spent the day exploring the town. The kids loved the small shops filled with trinkets and handmade crafts. Claire found a bakery that sold fresh soda bread, and I tried some local seafood at a street stall near the docks. Everything seemed normal, even pleasant, and I found myself wondering if the weird vibe from the night before was just in my head. By the time evening rolled around, the streets were filled with the smells of roasted chestnuts and wood smoke, and we made our way toward the main square where the festival would start. The sky was turning a deep orange as the sun began to set, and lanterns were being lit along the streets. People were dressed in all sorts of costumes, some modern, some looking like they belonged to another century. A group of kids, probably local, ran past us wearing masks similar to the one Jake had pointed out the day before. Something about the way they moved, almost too fast, too silent, sent a chill down my spine, but I shook it off. Just kids being kids, I told myself. The highlight of the night was supposed to be the ghost tour up to the castle. We met the tour guide, a wiry man named Fergus, at the edge of town. He had a lantern in one hand and a walking stick in the other. "Right, everyone," he said cheerfully. "I hope you've all got your wits about you. We're heading up to Dunmore Castle, and I won't be responsible if anyone wanders off." We all laughed nervously, but as we started the climb up the narrow path toward the ruins, the lighthearted mood began to shift. The higher we went, the more isolated it felt. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the fog started to roll in from the sea. Fergus told us stories along the way, legends about the castle's history, tales of battles fought on the cliffs, and of course, the Banshee. It said she comes for those who stray too far. Fergus explained as we reached the castle's crumbling entrance. She whispers their names on the wind, and once you hear it, well, there's no coming back. Inside the castle ruins, the air was damp and cold, and everything felt heavy, like the walls were holding on to centuries of memories. The guide led us through the outer courtyard, showing us where the old kitchens used to be, the remnants of a collapsed tower, and the stone steps that led to the dungeon below. The kids stayed close to us, though Emma kept glancing around like she was expecting something. At one point, Fergus stopped by a small archway and pointed to some strange carvings on the wall. "These are the marks left by the old ones," he said, tracing his finger over the stone. "It was part of a ritual to keep the Banshee at bay. But," he added with a grin, "it didn't always work." The group chuckled nervously, but just as Fergus finished speaking, a low, distant sound drifted through the air, a soft, wailing cry that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Everyone froze. It was faint but unmistakable. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Fergus raised his lantern, scanning the surrounding walls. Probably just the wind, he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. All right, let's keep moving. As we continued deeper into the castle, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The corridors were narrow, with sharp turns that made it easy to get disoriented. Claire squeezed my hand tightly, and I could feel her tension rising. The kids, who had been so excited earlier, were now unusually quiet. That's when Emma whispered, "Daddy, do you hear that?" I stopped in my tracks and listened. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of the wind outside. But then, faintly, I heard a voice. A soft, whispering voice, calling Emma's name. I crouched down to Emma's level and tried to keep my voice steady. "Sweetheart, where did you hear it?" She pointed toward a dark corner just beyond the guide's lantern light. From over there, Jake, clinging to Claire's coat, said, "I heard it too, but it said my name." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced at Claire, and her face told me everything. She'd heard it too. But she wasn't about to panic in front of the kids. "Let's stay close," I whispered, trying to sound calm. "It's probably just someone from the group messing around." We pushed forward with the rest of the group, the lanterns casting flickering shadows on the ancient stone walls. But the whispers didn't stop. They would come in short bursts, soft, almost like the wind, but they weren't random. Every few moments, I could make out my kids' names. Emma, Jake. Each time, the sound seemed to come from deeper within the castle, luring us in. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the way the wind twisted through the cracks in the walls. Maybe one of the other tourists was trying to spook us. But no one else in the group seemed to notice. Or if they did, they were pretending not to. Then Emma said something that made my heart drop. "Daddy, it sounds friendly." Friendly. There was nothing friendly about it. But before I could say anything, she slipped her hand out of mine and took a step toward the dark passageway. "Emma, no!" Claire hissed, grabbing her arm. Emma blinked like she'd just woken from a dream, confused as to why we were all staring at her. "It's okay," she said. "They're calling us. They want us to follow." Jake tugged on Claire's sleeve, looking up at her with wide eyes. "We have to go. We have to help them." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a game or some weird tourist attraction. Fergus led us deeper into the ruins, through a narrow doorway that opened into a large, open hall. The stone walls were cracked and crumbling, with vines creeping in through the gaps. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and the air smelled damp and ancient, like wet earth and decaying leaves. "This was the Great Hall," Fergus said, holding his lantern high. "It said that long ago, this is where the villagers would gather during Samhain to keep the spirits at bay. They'd light a fire and tell stories until dawn." As he spoke, I noticed something strange about the walls. They were covered in old carvings, symbols and figures that looked like they had been scratched into the stone centuries ago. Some of the symbols were familiar, simple spirals and crosses, but others were more disturbing. Figures with long, twisting limbs, mouths open in silent screams. Jake stared at the carvings with a blank expression. "They're waiting," he whispered, almost to himself. My skin crawled. Claire shot me a look, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. We needed to leave. Now. But just as I was about to speak, Emma pointed toward the far end of the hall, where a narrow archway led into darkness. "They went that way," she whispered. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the fear in Emma's voice, or the way Jake's eyes seemed glazed over, like he was in a trance. But I found myself stepping toward the archway, dragging the kids with me. "Wait!" Claire grabbed my arm. "We need to stay with the group." I glanced over my shoulder at Fergus and the others. but they were already moving on, disappearing down another corridor. "We won't go far," I whispered, "just to see what's there. We'll catch up." Claire looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my voice must have convinced her. She nodded reluctantly, and together we stepped through the archway. The moment we crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The air felt thick, like we'd walked into a different world entirely. The lantern's light flickered, and for a moment, I thought it might go out. The passageway was narrow, with walls that seemed to close in on us the farther we went. Every step echoed unnaturally, as if the walls were swallowing the sound. And then we heard it again, whispers. But this time, it wasn't just Emma's and Jake's names. It was mine and Claire's. We stopped dead in our tracks. Claire's hand tightened around mine, and I could feel her shaking. "This isn't right," she whispered. "We need to get out of here." But the kids, they were acting strange. Jake was staring down the corridor, his eyes wide but unfocused, like he was looking at something only he could see. Emma was smiling, a soft, dreamy smile that sent chills down my spine. "They're waiting for us," Emma said. Before we could react, she slipped out of Claire's grasp and started running down the corridor. Jake followed without hesitation. "Emma! Jake!" Claire screamed, but they didn't even look back. We chased after them, the lantern swinging wildly in my hand. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until we had to duck our heads to keep moving. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the corridor ended. We stumbled into a small, circular chamber, the walls lined with more of those strange carvings. In the center of the room was a stone altar, cracked and worn with age. And standing behind it was a figure. It was barely more than a shadow, a tall, gaunt shape with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. It looked ancient, like it had been waiting there for centuries. The kid stood in front of the altar, perfectly still. "Emma! Jake!" Claire cried, but they didn't move. The figure raised a hand, and the room seemed to tilt, like the very air was being pulled toward it. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a sound, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the chamber, vibrating through my bones. It was the same sound we'd heard earlier, the banshee's cry. Claire and I froze as that terrible sound filled the chamber. It was nothing like the whispers before. This was deeper, older, like the air itself was mourning. It reverberated through my chest, making my heart stutter and my head spin. I could feel it pulling at something inside me, as though it wanted to peel away every thought, every ounce of reason, and leave me hollow. "Jake! Emma!" I shouted again, trying to snap them out of whatever trance they were in. They didn't even flinch. They stood perfectly still, side by side, their small hands dangling at their sides, their eyes blank and unfocused. Emma's lips twitched, forming a word I couldn't hear, like she was speaking directly to the thing standing behind the altar. I took a step forward, but Claire yanked me back. "Don't," she whispered, her voice tight with panic. "We need to get out of here. Something's wrong with them. But we can't just..." A sudden, sharp noise interrupted her, a deep crack that echoed through the chamber, like stone breaking. I glanced down and saw the floor beneath us starting to shift. The ancient stones were grinding against each other, creating jagged gaps that snaked across the room. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of damp earth and salt, and I could hear the distant roar of the sea outside the castle. But it wasn't just the ocean. There was something else beneath the sound of the waves, like the hum of distant voices, growing louder with every passing second. "Emma!" Claire's voice cracked as she tried again to pull the kids away from the altar. She rushed forward, but the moment she reached for them, the shadowy figure raised its hand again. And just like that, the kids began to move slow, deliberate steps backward, deeper into the shadows behind the altar. No! Claire lunged for them, but it was too late. The ground beneath her feet gave way with a deafening crunch, and she slipped, falling hard onto the uneven stones. I grabbed her arm just in time, pulling her back before she could fall into one of the widening cracks. The figure behind the altar watched us silently, its grin never changing. I knew then, without a doubt, that it wanted us to leave, but it wanted to keep the kids. A sharp gust of wind blew through the chamber, extinguishing the lantern in my hand. The darkness closed in fast, wrapping around us like a suffocating blanket. I could hear Claire breathing hard beside me, her hand gripping my wrist so tight it hurt. "Get up," I whispered urgently. "We need to move. Now." We scrambled to our feet, the sound of shifting stone echoing around us. I fumbled for my phone, using the dim light from the screen to cut through the darkness. The kids were gone. "Emma! Jake!" Claire's voice was hoarse with fear, her words barely audible over the rising hum of voices. I aimed the light toward the altar, hoping, praying, to see them standing there. But the space was empty. "Where are they?" Claire whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too focused on the passageway we'd come through, trying to figure out if we could make it back. The air was thick, and it felt like the walls were closing in around us. And then, just as suddenly as they disappeared, the whispers started again. Only this time, they weren't distant. They were right next to us. I turned in circles, the small beam from my phone casting frantic shadows on the stone walls. The voices whispered our names over and over, in tones that were almost familiar. It sounded like the kids, but not quite, like someone trying to mimic their voices. "Mommy, Daddy." Claire let out a strangled sob, and I grabbed her hand. "Stay with me," I whispered. "We'll find them. We'll get out of here. I promise." But even as I said the words, I felt the weight of doubt settle in my chest. The whispers were coming from every direction, bouncing off the walls in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't tell where they were leading us, whether they were drawing us closer to the kids or luring us deeper into the ruin. "Follow me," I said, tugging Claire toward the passageway we'd entered from. "We just have to get back to the others. Fergus will know what to do." But as soon as we reached the archway, we stopped dead. The way back, it wasn't there. The corridor we'd come through was gone, replaced by a solid wall of stone. "What the?" I ran my hands along the wall, desperately searching for some crack, some hidden doorway we'd missed. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding stone. "This isn't happening," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "This can't be real." I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding, and my hands were slick with sweat. Every instinct was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. And then I saw it, a faint glow at the far end of the chamber, just beyond the altar. It was a soft, bluish light, flickering like the flame of a distant candle. I didn't know what it was, but it was the only thing in this nightmare that felt real, tangible. "We have to go that way," I whispered, pulling Claire toward the light. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the wall that had once been the way out. But then she nodded, gripping my hand like a lifeline. Together, we moved toward the light, our footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. The closer we got, the louder the whispers became, soft, urgent pleas that made my skin crawl. And then, just as we reached the glowing doorway, I heard it. "Daddy, help us." It was Emma's voice, clear and desperate. Without thinking, I rushed toward the sound, dragging Claire with me. The glow grew brighter, enveloping us in its cold, unnatural light. And then everything went still. The next thing I knew, we were standing in another part of the ruin, an open courtyard bathed in pale moonlight. The wind howled through the broken walls, carrying with it the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs below. And there, standing at the edge of the courtyard, were Emma and Jake. "Emma!" Claire cried, rushing toward them. But the moment she touched them, they vanished, flickering out of existence like smoke in the wind. And in their place stood the shadowy figure from the altar, grinning that same terrible grin. It took a step toward us, and I knew, deep in my bones, that if we didn't leave now, we never would. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Claire's hand and pulling her toward the edge of the courtyard. We sprinted through the ruins, the sound of whispers chasing us through the darkness. Every step felt like we were running in place, the walls shifting around us, trying to trap us inside. But somehow, we found our way out, stumbling through a narrow gap in the stone and into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. Claire climbed into the passenger seat, gasping for breath. "Where are the kids?" she whispered, her voice hollow with fear. I didn't answer. I just started the engine and slammed my foot on the gas, desperate to put as much distance between us and that place as possible. As we sped down the narrow road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the road, watching us leave. If you are currently enjoying this story, pause the video and please subscribe to the Horror Shack, and make sure you like this video and leave us a comment saying I am enjoying the story, as this would help us get feedback and also encourage us to tell more true spine-chilling stories like this one. Now let's continue the story. The shadow lingered in my rearview mirror longer than it should have. It was as if it wasn't just watching us leave. It knew something. Knew we weren't really free. My hands trembled on the wheel as I floored the gas pedal, the car roaring down the desolate cliffside road. Claire was gripping the dashboard so hard her knuckles turned white, her breath ragged and fast. "We'll find them," I said, though the words felt hollow, even to me. Claire didn't respond. She sat rigid in her seat, her wide eyes darting from the road ahead to the black wilderness outside her window, as if any second, something might leap from the shadows and drag us back into the ruins. The night was unnaturally quiet. No chirping insects, no distant hum of wildlife. Just the rumble of the engine and the steady pulse of our shallow breaths. A thick mist was beginning to coil along the road, swirling around the tires. My headlights barely cut through it, casting eerie beams that twisted into strange shapes. "Jake and Emma," Claire whispered, her voice brittle. What if that wasn't really them? I glanced at her, feeling a lump rise in my throat. I had been asking myself the same thing, but hearing her say it aloud made it worse, like acknowledging the possibility gave it power. The figures we'd seen could have been anything. Something wearing their faces, their voices. Something ancient and hungry. "We'll get them back," I said, gripping the wheel tighter. But how? I didn't even know where they were or what had taken them. Then, without warning, the car's dashboard flickered. The radio buzzed with static, and the headlights dimmed, plunging us into near darkness. "Come on," I muttered, slamming my palm against the steering wheel. But the more I tried to steady the car, the worse it got. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. The headlights blinked out completely, leaving us stranded in the mist, swallowed whole by the night. We sat in suffocating silence. The mist pressed against the windows like something alive, tendrils creeping along the glass. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. No bars, no connection to the outside world. "Try your phone," I said, though I knew it wouldn't work. Claire fumbled in her pocket, but her hands were shaking too hard to unlock the screen. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice cracking with disbelief. I leaned back in my seat, forcing my brain to think. We couldn't stay here. Not in the dark, not in this place. I reached for the flashlight in the glove compartment, the metal cool against my clammy hands. "Stay close," I told Claire. "We'll walk back to the town, or at least find help on the road." I hated how thin my words sounded, but we didn't have a choice. Sitting here, waiting, felt like inviting something worse to find us. We stepped out of the car into the freezing mist. It clung to our clothes, heavy and wet, wrapping around us like a second skin. The road behind us had vanished. There was no sign of the path we'd driven, no tracks in the dirt, only an endless expanse of fog that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I strained my ears. At first, there was only silence. Then I heard it footsteps, light, deliberate, just ahead, hidden within the mist. "Jake!" Claire called out, her voice breaking. The footsteps stopped, and then, faint but unmistakable, we heard Emma's voice. "Mommy? Daddy? Help us!" Claire bolted forward before I could stop her. "Emma!" she screamed, plunging into the mist. I cursed under my breath and followed, the flashlight beam flickering wildly as I stumbled after her. "Claire, wait. It's not them." I never got to finish. The ground beneath us shifted again, just like in the ruins. 1 second, we were running down the fog-choked road. The next, we were somewhere else entirely. The mist thinned, revealing a sprawling field of tall grass, swaying gently under a sky too black to be natural. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of seawater and decay. In the distance, I could see the faint outline of the castle ruins. Only now, they were far larger, stretching across the horizon like the remnants of some ancient cursed city. "Where are we?" Claire whispered, her voice small. I shook my head, too stunned to answer. It was as though we had stepped through a tear in reality, a place that didn't belong in the world we knew. And then we saw them. Jake and Emma were standing at the edge of the field, their backs to us, holding hands. They didn't move. They didn't turn around. They just stood there, facing the darkness beyond the ruins. "Emma! Jake!" Claire called, her voice hoarse with desperation. She started toward them, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I whispered, my gut churning with dread. Something was wrong. The children stood too still, their heads tilted slightly to the side, as if listening to something only they could hear. And then, slowly, they turned to face us. Their eyes were completely black. Claire let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, but the children began to walk toward us, their faces devoid of emotion. Their small feet made no sound as they moved through the grass, their bodies swaying unnaturally like puppets on strings. "We need to run," I whispered, pulling Claire with me. But she was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. The children's mouths opened, too wide, far wider than any human mouth should. And from their throats came a horrible, guttural sound, like the shriek of a storm tearing through a forest. I yanked Claire's arm hard, snapping her out of her trance. "Run!" I shouted, dragging her back toward the ruins. The children, or whatever they were, followed, their movements jerky and erratic like broken marionettes. We sprinted through the field, our hearts pounding, the cold air burning in our lungs. The ruins loomed closer with every step, their jagged spires cutting into the dark sky like the teeth of some colossal beast. I could hear the children behind us, their footsteps growing louder, faster. We reached the edge of the ruins just as Claire stumbled, her ankle twisting on the uneven ground. I caught her before she fell, but the children were closing in fast. "There!" Claire gasped, pointing to a narrow archway half buried in rubble. We squeezed through just as the children reached the entrance, their tiny hands grasping at the stones. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the whispers started again, soft, insistent. They weren't coming from the children anymore. They were coming from inside the ruins. The archway led to a spiral staircase that descended deep into the earth. There was no other way out, so we started down, the air growing colder with every step. The whispers followed us, wrapping around us like tendrils of smoke. I could feel them pressing against my mind, urging me to stop, to turn around, to listen. At the bottom of the stairs, we found ourselves in a vast, underground chamber. In the center of the room stood an ancient stone well. The whispers grew louder, emanating from the darkness within. And then I understood. This was the heart of the curse, the place where everything began. The children stood at the edge of the well, their black eyes gleaming in the dim light. They raised their hands, beckoning us closer. Claire clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know, but I knew one thing for certain. If we didn't stop this, we would never leave this place. And neither would our children. I could feel the air thickening, as if every breath I took pulled something ancient and foul into my lungs. The children, or what looked like our children, stood motionless by the well, their dark eyes unblinking. The whispers coiled around us, urging us forward. They weren't just voices anymore. They carried intent, promises of something just out of reach, answers, salvation, but at a cost. Claire trembled at my side, her nails cutting deeper into my arm. She was shivering, not from cold but from pure, bone-deep fear. I could tell she wanted to move toward the children, to scoop them up and leave this nightmare behind. But she also knew, somehow, we weren't dealing with Jake and Emma anymore. There was something else, something using their faces, their small, familiar voices to lure us deeper. "Don't listen to them," I whispered to Claire, though I wasn't sure if the warning was for her or myself. The whispers tugged at the back of my mind, soft yet insistent. They whispered memories I thought I'd forgotten, moments of regret, guilt, promises I'd broken. They promised redemption, peace, but I knew better. This place had no mercy. "Claire," I said, tugging her arm gently, "we need to move. We can't trust them." She hesitated for a heartbeat, her eyes locked on the children's eerie silhouettes. Then, reluctantly, she gave a shaky nod, and we backed away from the well, one slow step at a time. That's when the children began to change. Their small bodies twitched and convulsed as if something was trying to crawl out from inside their skin. Their heads jerked to unnatural angles, and their mouths opened in grotesque grins far too wide for their faces. Black liquid, thick as tar, began to drip from their lips and eyes, pooling at their feet. The whispers grew louder, merging into one terrible voice that resonated through the cavern walls. "Stay with us. We've been waiting." The voice was both familiar and foreign, a sick parody of the children's laughter mixed with the low, rasping tones of something that had existed for centuries. Something older than the ruins. Then they lunged. Jake's small hands grabbed Claire's wrist with impossible strength. She screamed, trying to shake him off, but his grip was unyielding. Emma's blackened eyes locked onto me as she reached for my neck, her fingers cold and sharp like claws. I swatted at her with the flashlight, the beam flickering wildly in the dark. The light struck her face, and for a brief moment, the thing wearing Emma's skin recoiled, hissing like a serpent. "Light!" I shouted, slamming the flashlight beam toward Jake. He staggered, releasing Claire with a shriek that echoed unnaturally, as if 100 voices were wailing at once. "Run!" I grabbed Claire's hand, and we sprinted deeper into the ruins, the children's twisted laughter following us, bouncing off the stone walls. When Claire woke up, the ruins were gone. The mist had lifted, and the sun was rising over the horizon. Jake and Emma lay beside her, sleeping peacefully, their faces free of the blackened eyes and twisted grins. But I was gone. Claire searched for me for hours, days, even weeks, but I was never found. The well was gone, along with every trace of the ruins. And yet on quiet nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the mist rolls in over the hills, Claire swears she can hear my voice, whispering from somewhere far below. "Run!" I don't know how long we stood there in the passageway, my wife and I clutching each other, the sounds of the wind and waves muffled behind the thick stone walls of the ruins. Our hearts raced, and the children's soft whispers, barely audible but persistent, came from deeper inside the dark corridor. "We have to find them," I whispered, trying to convince myself more than my wife. The air around us felt heavy, not cold exactly, but dense, like the atmosphere before a storm breaks. Every few steps we took deeper into the castle, the feeling worsened. The walls, narrow and ancient, seemed to shift as if they were alive, closing us in. The stone felt damp under my hand, and the smell of salt, moss, and something else, something stale like old earth, hung in the air. We called out the children's names again and again, our voices echoing uselessly through the twisting corridors. But all we got in return were the same faint giggles and whispers from up ahead. It was their voices, no doubt about it, but there was something off, too distant, too calm, as if they weren't afraid at all. The narrow passageway opened suddenly into a small chamber, its ceiling high and jagged from collapsed stones. Moonlight streamed through a gaping hole in the wall, illuminating a worn, circular platform at the center of the room. On it lay a strange pattern of ancient symbols carved into the stone floor, smeared with what looked like dried wax and blackened ash. The air grew heavier still, and my skin tingled as if some unseen force was watching us. And then we saw them, our children standing on the edge of the platform. "Liam, Emma," my wife's voice broke, and she lunged toward them. But before we could reach them, they turned slowly toward us, their faces blank, their eyes distant, almost as if they were looking through us. Emma tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, strange smile. Liam whispered something under his breath, too low to hear. My stomach churned with a sudden wave of nausea. Something wasn't right. "Come back, please," I shouted, my voice shaky and desperate. "We have to leave now." Emma's smile grew wider, unnatural, and Liam raised a hand as if to shush us. Then, without a word, Both children turned away and stepped toward a dark archway at the far end of the chamber. "Don't move!" I yelled, but it was like they didn't even hear me. We chased after them, scrambling through the rubble, tripping over loose stones as panic clawed at my chest. My wife was crying now, her breath ragged and broken. The children disappeared into the archway, their figures swallowed whole by the dark. We followed them into a deeper corridor that twisted downward, the air growing colder with every step. I felt an overwhelming sense of being drawn in, as though the walls themselves were pulling us deeper into the castle's bowels. And with each turn, the voices, those soft, playful giggles, continued to drift ahead of us, always just out of reach. Then, just when I thought I'd lost them for good, we reached a dead end. It was a small chamber, this one darker than the last, with no windows or moonlight to guide us. The children stood in the center of the room, perfectly still, their backs to us. "Liam, Emma!" I shouted again, stepping forward, but the moment I reached for them, the air shifted. A cold breeze, impossible in a sealed room, brushed past my face, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of a low, mournful wail. It started soft, like someone singing a lullaby, but then grew louder, turning into a keening cry that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. My wife gasped and clutched my arm. "The Banshee," she whispered in terror, her voice barely audible. Suddenly, the children's heads turned toward us, but their bodies didn't move. It was like their necks twisted too far, their faces looking back at us with cold, lifeless expressions. My heart stopped in my chest. Their eyes were vacant, dark, and distant, as if they were no longer our children but something else entirely. That's when I saw her. Out of the shadows, just behind the children, emerged a figure, a woman with long, stringy black hair that flowed like seaweed. Her eyes were empty, sunken hollows, and her mouth hung open, wailing softly, the sound vibrating through my bones. Her body was pale, almost translucent, like she had been pulled from the bottom of the ocean. The Banshee of the Cliffs. I froze. The stories weren't just old legends. She was real, and she was here. The Banshee moved toward the children, her thin, bony hands reaching out to touch their shoulders. And that's when I knew, if we didn't act now, we'd lose them forever. She was claiming them. With a burst of adrenaline, I grabbed both children by their arms and yanked them backward. They were heavy, much heavier than they should have been, like dead weight. My wife screamed as she helped me pull them away from the Banshee's grasp. For a split second, the spirit's empty eyes met mine, and I felt a cold dread unlike anything I've ever known. It was as if she saw into me, knew every fear I had, every failure, and fed on it. I didn't look back. We ran. My wife and I carried the children, their bodies limp and cold in our arms, as we fled through the dark, twisting corridors of the castle. Behind us, the Banshee's wail grew louder, more desperate, echoing off the stone walls as if the very castle was screaming with her. The walls seemed to shift again, the corridors narrowing and twisting in ways that didn't make sense, but somehow we found our way back to the surface. We burst out of the ruins, gasping for air as the wind howled around us. The children stirred in our arms, their eyes fluttering open as if waking from a deep sleep. "Mom? Dad?" Emma's voice was small, confused. "What happened?" "We're okay," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "We're leaving. Right now." We didn't stop to explain. We ran back to the car, my heart hammering in my chest, adrenaline propelling me forward. I could feel the weight of something behind us, like a presence following close, just out of sight. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It sputtered for a second, and for a horrifying moment, I thought we were trapped. But then it roared to life. As I pulled out of the parking lot, tires skidding on the wet gravel, I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. And there she was. The Banshee stood at the edge of the road, her hollow eyes fixed on us, her mouth slightly open as if whispering a curse. The sight of her made my blood run cold. She didn't move, just stood there, watching as we drove away, her figure fading into the mist that rolled in from the cliffs. We drove in silence for a long time. The only sound, the hum of the engine and the distant crash of waves against the shore. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. We never went back to that town. To this day, the children don't remember what happened in those ruins. And maybe that's for the best. But sometimes, late at night, I wake up with that wailing sound still echoing in my mind. And every now and then, when I look into the children's eyes, I see a flicker of something distant, like a memory buried too deep to reach. We escaped that night, but part of me wonders if we ever really left. And every Halloween, without fail, I dream of the Banshee, standing at the edge of the cliffs waiting, watching for us to return. And just like that, it was over. Or at least, that's what we told ourselves. But some nights, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can still hear the whispers calling our names. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks, or maybe something followed us home from those ruins. Well, that's the end of this story. But the question is, will you be able to sleep tonight? If you do, let's hope nothing calls for you from the dark. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the Horror Shack, and share this story with someone you think is brave enough to handle it. Now, I'll leave these eerie sounds to drift you off. If you can sleep at all,